a multi-millionaire heir to a private aviation empire. A man with access to sprawling properties, helicopters, and limitless cash. Yet, in the dead of night, he fired up a $25,000 industrial incinerator to erase a hard-working family man from existence. His motive wasn't a bitter corporate rivalry or a high-stakes ransom. He destroyed a life and shattered a family, all to steal a used Dodge pickup truck, a vehicle he could have easily bought with pocket change. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. The Milliard family name was practically royalty in the private aviation sector. The dynasty began decades earlier, built from the ground up by a patriarchal figure who launched Milliard Air, a massive charter airline that eventually transitioned into a highly lucrative aircraft maintenance business. Born into this sprawling empire, the young heir inherited a life most people cannot even fathom. He grew up on massive estates, surrounded by luxury vehicles, private runways, and a seemingly endless flow of capital. By his early teens, he was setting aviation records, flying solo helicopters long before he could legally drive a car. When his father passed away, the keys to the entire kingdom fell into his hands. He took ownership of a colossal 50,000 square foot aviation hangar located at a regional airport, a massive steel fortress that he treated as his personal playground. Inside that hangar, the sheer scale of wealth was staggering. The polished concrete floors housed fleets of vintage cars, expensive off-road vehicles, and custom-built commercial trailers. The heir didn't just have money, he had absolute, unchecked freedom. There were no financial limitations, no authorities to answer to, and no consequences for his actions. He could travel anywhere on a whim, throwing lavish parties that lasted for days, funding the lifestyles of his sycophantic friends who fed his ego. But endless privilege breeds a very specific type of darkness. When you can afford anything the world has to offer, the material value of objects begins to evaporate. Buying a high-end sports car or a heavy-duty truck offered no thrill. The transaction was too easy. The only way to feel anything, the only way to cure the suffocating boredom of absolute wealth, was to take things that belonged to others. It was a psychological mutation. His entitlement morphed into a god complex. He began stealing heavy machinery, construction equipment, and vehicles. Not for profit, but for the sheer adrenaline rush. It was a terrifying game. He needed to prove that the rules governing ordinary society simply did not apply to him. He viewed the world as a personal hunting ground, and other people as mere pawns existing for his amusement. Miles away from the sprawling private hangars and multi-million-dollar trusts lived a man who represented the exact opposite of that unearned privilege. He was a 32-year-old devoted husband and a father to a young daughter. He built his life on early mornings, hard physical labor, and the quiet satisfaction of providing for his family. Every dollar he earned was accounted for, channeled into mortgages, groceries, and the future of his child. He drove a heavy-duty 2007 Dodge Ram 3500. The truck was a workhorse, a symbol of his blue-collar reality, carrying tools and memories alike. But as expenses mounted and priorities shifted toward his family's needs, he made a practical decision. He needed to sell the pickup to clear some debt and find a more suitable family vehicle. He detailed the interior, took a few photos in his driveway, and posted a listing on a popular online classified site. It was a routine transaction, the kind of mundane digital handshake that happens thousands of times a day across the country. Someone posts an ad, a buyer calls, they agree on a price, and they shake hands. The seller expected nothing more than a simple cash exchange to help his family move forward. Instead, his digital listing caught the eye of a predator. Sitting inside his fortress of steel and concrete, the aviation heir scrolled through the classifieds. He didn't want to buy the truck. He wanted the high of taking it. The god complex demanded a new thrill, and the target had just been locked. The aviation heir did not operate in a vacuum. Every predator needs a shadow, someone to validate their delusions of grandeur. He found his in a 25-year-old aspiring rapper with a minor criminal record and a life strictly confined to his mother's basement. The power dynamic between the two men was absolute and entirely lopsided. The heir provided the funding, the luxury vehicles, and the intoxicating illusion of a high-stakes lifestyle. In return, the younger man offered blind, unwavering loyalty. He was less of a partner and more of a trained attack dog, eager to impress a master who viewed the world as his personal property. Together, they formed a toxic, escalating feedback loop. What began as petty theft and suburban vandalism mutated over months into an appetite for severe, calculated violence. The aviation business was quietly hemorrhaging cash, but the heir's lavish expenditures had not slowed. He had recently developed an obsession with off-road desert racing, purchasing custom Baja vehicles that required massive, reinforced trailers for transport. To haul this heavy equipment across thousands of miles, he needed a very specific workhorse, a 3/4-ton diesel pickup. His bank accounts held millions. He could have walked into any dealership in the country and paid cash for a brand new fleet, but convenience offered no dopamine rush. Purchasing the truck removed the thrill of the hunt. He didn't just want the vehicle. He wanted the raw power of taking it from someone else. The planning phase was methodical, driven by the heir's arrogant belief that he possessed a criminal genius the authorities could never unravel. In early May, he stepped into a dimly lit convenience store and purchased a cheap prepaid cell phone, paying in untraceable cash. He activated the device under a fictitious name, securing a burner line that he believed effectively severed his digital footprint. Armed with this ghost phone, the two men retreated to the cavernous, echoing expanse of the aviation hangar. Surrounded by the faint smell of engine grease and jet fuel, illuminated only by the cold blue light of a laptop screen, they began scrolling through online automotive classifieds. It was a surreal, modern form of stalking. Everyday citizens post photos of their driveways, their manicured lawns, the interiors of their vehicles, unwittingly inviting predators into their lives. The heir analyzed these digital listings with clinical detachment, filtering out commercial dealerships to focus exclusively on private, individual sellers. Their initial hunting expedition occurred a day before the fatal encounter, and it nearly ended their game before it began. They zeroed in on a seller in a neighboring city who had listed an identical truck. The predators arranged an evening test drive, dropped off near the target's home by a third accomplice in a large SUV. But the situation immediately deteriorated. The seller was a towering, heavily muscled former military man who instantly sensed an unsettling shift in the atmosphere when the two strangers approached. They were too quiet, their body language entirely disjointed from the usual enthusiasm of a car buyer. During the brief test drive, the seller refused to yield control. He squeezed his large frame into the back seat, physically dominating the cramped space of the cab, and shut down their probing, awkward questions with short, defensive answers. The air inside the truck grew heavy with unspoken tension. The heir, sensing the tactical disadvantage, abandoned the plan. They cut the drive short, vanished down a dark street, and left the man alive, completely unaware of the abyss he had just stepped back from. But the God complex demanded satisfaction. The failure only sharpened the heir's predatory focus. The following evening, the glow of the laptop screen illuminated a new listing. It was a pristine black 2007 model located in a quiet, rural suburban community roughly 40 miles away. The photos showed a peaceful residential street, large lots, and a distinct lack of heavy security. It was the perfect stage. Using the burner phone, the heir left a casual voice message. When the callback came, he utilized a practiced, disarming tone. He asked standard, mundane questions about the engine's mileage, the condition of the tires, the vehicle's maximum towing capacity. He was polite, articulate, and completely devoid of menace. They agreed to meet for a test drive that same evening, just as the sun was scheduled to dip below the horizon. The preparation for the meeting was swift and chillingly pragmatic. The heir and his shadow stripped away their expensive watches and designer clothing, dressing down in dark, nondescript hoodies to blend into the suburban landscape. Before leaving the hangar, the heir packed a small, unassuming satchel. Inside, heavy and cold, was a compact handgun. This was never intended to be a simple vehicle theft. The weapon was not packed for intimidation, nor was it a contingency plan for a robbery gone wrong. The heir had already made his decision. The truck was coming back to the hangar tonight, and whoever held the keys was simply an acceptable casualty in his twisted pursuit of ultimate control. Monday, May 6th. The air carried that distinct evening chill, typical of early spring, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, casting long, fading shadows across the manicured lawns. Inside the sprawling rural property, dinner had just wrapped up. The seller, a man deeply rooted in his community, known for his relentless work ethic and easy smile, was finalizing the details of the impending transaction. He stood in the kitchen, chatting with his wife, while glancing out the window toward the heavy-duty Dodge Ram parked in the driveway. The truck was spotless, freshly washed and detailed for the new owners. The plan was entirely routine. The buyers would arrive, inspect the engine, take a quick drive down the local rural routes, hand over the cash, and be on their way. The funds would clear a path for a newer, more family-friendly vehicle. It was a mundane chore on a standard weekday. At roughly 9:20, the sweeping headlights of a large SUV cut across the dark asphalt at the edge of the property. The vehicle didn't pull into the driveway. Instead, it idled near the property line, dropping off two figures before silently accelerating away into the night. Footsteps crunched heavily on the loose gravel. The seller stepped out of the warm glow of his front porch to greet them, while his wife stood just inside the doorway, observing the interaction through the glass. The physical contrast between the two strangers was stark and immediately unsettling. The primary speaker was tall, lanky, projecting a practiced, almost overly polite demeanor. His companion was significantly shorter, hunched, his face obscured by a dark hood, shifting his weight nervously in the shadows. He looked completely out of place in the quiet, upscale neighborhood. The wife felt a sharp, sudden knot of apprehension form in her stomach. Something about the duo felt deeply asymmetrical, a discordant note in an otherwise ordinary evening. The tall man took the lead, asking standard automotive questions and requesting to see under the hood. The seller obliged, reaching into the cab to pop the latch. The heavy metallic clunk of the hood opening echoed in the quiet night air. For a few minutes, the three men leaned over the engine block, the glow of a small flashlight illuminating the mechanics. The buyer nodded, expressing satisfaction, and suggested they take the truck out to test the transmission. The seller agreed, as it was standard protocol to accompany a stranger, ensuring the vehicle wasn't simply driven off the lot and stolen. He turned back toward the house, catching his wife's eye one last time. He offered a quick, reassuring wave, indicating he would be right back. The tall stranger climbed into the driver's seat. The seller took the passenger side. The hooded figure slipped into the cramped space of the rear cab, directly behind the owner. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, a deep vibrating rumble that rattled the windows of the house. The brake lights flared red in the darkness. The gears shifted, and the truck rolled slowly down the driveway, merging onto the rural highway. The wife watched the red taillights shrink into the distance, until they were swallowed completely by the blackness of the road. Inside the cab, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The polite facade evaporated. The road ahead was unlit, empty, surrounded by dense farmland. The interior of the truck was bathed in the harsh green glow of the dashboard instrument panel. The heater blew dry air. The rhythmic hum of the heavy tires on the pavement provided the only sound. The conversation died. The silence grew heavy, suffocating. The driver stared straight ahead, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The seller turned his head, sensing the sudden drop in temperature, the palpable shift in the space. He looked toward the driver, then toward the rearview mirror. The man in the back seat was no longer slouching. He was sitting up. The movement was sharp, deliberate. The seller realized the terrifying reality of his situation. He was trapped inside a moving metal box, hurtling down a deserted two-lane highway at 60 miles per hour. There was nowhere to run, no handle to pull. The driver reached into the small satchel resting on his lap. The movement was practiced, fluid. He pulled the compact handgun. The metallic click of the slide echoed over the diesel engine. The seller barely had time to process the steel barrel leveling in his direction. There was no negotiation, no demand for the keys, no warning. The predator did not want to steal the truck and leave a witness. He wanted the absolute power of the kill. A single shot shattered the enclosed space, deafening, final. The heavy caliber round found its mark instantly. The violent, concussive force filled the cab with the sharp, acidic smell of burnt gunpowder and the heavy, metallic stench of fresh blood. The seller slumped forward. The struggle was over before it began. a life extinguished in a fraction of a second, all for a piece of machinery. The driver didn't panic, he didn't swerve. His heart rate barely spiked. He simply kept his foot on the accelerator, guiding the 3-ton vehicle smoothly through the darkness, the lifeless body of the owner bleeding out into the passenger seat upholstery. The God complex was fully fed. He had successfully taken a life, proving to himself that he existed entirely outside the boundaries of human morality. The hooded accomplice in the back seat remained silent, entirely subservient to the violence he had just witnessed. They needed to secure the prize. The stolen truck, now a rolling crime scene, was navigated through a labyrinth of back roads, heading straight toward the sprawling aviation hangar. Within an hour, the heavy rolling doors of the private aerospace facility ground open. The truck was driven deep into the cavernous concrete belly of the building. The doors slid shut, sealing them off from the outside world. The fluorescent industrial lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile blue-white glare over the blood-soaked interior of the cab. The heir stepped out of the vehicle, his dark clothing stained, his demeanor utterly detached. He was no longer a murderer. He was a project manager handling a logistical inconvenience. He ordered his shadow to begin the cleanup. The interior of the Dodge required total sterilization. They began ripping out the seats, tearing up the saturated carpeting, and dismantling the dashboard components that had been compromised by the violent discharge. But the most pressing issue was the physical evidence of the victim. The heir walked to the far corner of his industrial fortress. Sitting on a massive steel trailer was his recent, highly specialized purchase. It was a heavy-duty, commercial-grade animal incinerator, internally branded as the Eliminator. It was a towering piece of machinery designed to vaporize massive agricultural carcasses at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The heir had purchased it weeks prior, using his vast financial resources to bypass the usual agricultural licensing questions. He connected the heavy propane lines. The steel doors were unlatched. The industrial burners ignited with a deep, echoing roar, the extreme heat instantly warping the air around the machine. The victim was stripped of his humanity, reduced to mere biological waste in the eyes of his killer, and loaded into the firing chamber. The heavy doors slammed shut. The temperature gauges spiked. Inside the steel belly of the machine, all physical evidence of the hard-working father, the devoted husband, was methodically and utterly destroyed. Outside the hangar, the night remained quiet. The stars shone indifferently over the massive estate. The heir had played his deadly game, won his prize, and erased his tracks. He believed he was entirely untouchable. The wife stood by the front window, her forehead resting against the cold glass. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The rural road remained empty. No headlights swept across the manicured lawn. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed in the quiet hallway. She stepped back into the kitchen, picking up her mobile phone. She dialed his number. It rang out and automatically switched to a generic voicemail greeting. She dropped the call and tried again. Same result. The knot in her stomach tightened into a dense, freezing dread. Her husband was a creature of strict routine. He was tethered to his family. He would never ignore her calls, and he would absolutely never vanish without a word. An hour crawled by, stretching into an eternity. The silence in the house grew suffocating. The digital display on the stove clicked to midnight. The driveway remained an empty void. She paced the living room floor, endlessly replaying the mental footage of the two strangers. The tall, overly polite one who did all the talking. The hunched, quiet one shifting nervously in the dark hoodie. They were a bizarre mismatch, a jagged, wrong piece in an otherwise normal puzzle. Her fingers trembled violently as she dialed the local police precinct, her voice breaking as she explained that the test drive was supposed to last 10 minutes, and it had been hours. Law enforcement agencies are traditionally slow to react when an adult male is reported missing. Standard protocol typically assumes a voluntary departure, a sudden breakdown in communication, a late night that spiraled out of control. But the narrative provided by the frantic wife shattered every standard mold. Her husband had departed with two complete strangers in a 3-ton vehicle into the pitch black of a rural highway. He left his wallet resting on the kitchen counter. He left his daily medication sitting in the cabinet. He took nothing but the keys. The officers arrived at the residence shortly after 2 in the morning, their boots crunching on the gravel. They stood in the driveway, shining high-powered tactical flashlights over the empty asphalt where the heavy-duty pickup had been parked just hours prior. The initial assessment was grim, yet still hopeful. Vehicles stolen during test drives were not an uncommon occurrence. But in almost every historical instance, the rightful owners were shoved out of the cab a few blocks away. They walked to a gas station, they flagged down a passing car. They did not simply dissolve into the night air. The police immediately began knocking on neighboring doors, waking up the suburban street, searching for anyone who might have seen which direction the black truck turned. They simultaneously pinged the missing man's cell phone, but the signal was completely dead. The device had been powered off or destroyed shortly after the vehicle left the driveway. Investigators then pulled the call logs from the residence, isolating the number of the prospective buyer who had arranged the meeting. They ran the digits through the telecom databases, hoping for a quick address match. Instead, they hit a solid brick wall. The number belonged to a cheap, prepaid burner phone. It was registered to a fictitious name, purchased with untraceable cash. The realization hit the detectives hard. This was not a spur-of-the-moment joyride or a robbery of opportunity. This was a highly calculated, premeditated trap. The strangers had meticulously planned their approach, leaving absolutely no digital breadcrumbs behind. By dawn, the quiet neighborhood was transformed into an active command post, lined with flashing patrol cruisers and news vans. The sun rose over a community that was about to be thrust into a state of collective, sheer panic. The story broke on local morning broadcasts first, then spread like a digital wildfire across the province and the continent. A photograph of the smiling, hardworking father, paired with the license plate and description of the 2007 Dodge Ram, flooded social media feeds and television screens. The social echo was immediate, visceral, and profound. It struck a primal nerve within the public consciousness. This was not a high-risk individual caught in a dangerous underworld lifestyle. This was a suburban homeowner trying to sell a used truck online to clear some debt. It was a mundane transaction that millions of citizens executed every single day without a second thought. The terrifying realization settled heavily over the region. If a man could be swallowed by the dark right from his own front yard, the illusion of safety was entirely shattered. Friends, extended family, and hundreds of complete strangers mobilized with staggering, military-like precision. Command centers were hastily established in local church basements and rented community halls. Volunteers printed tens of thousands of flyers, taping them to telephone poles, highway rest stops, and grocery store bulletin boards across a radius stretching hundreds of miles. Organized search parties formed, walking shoulder to shoulder through dense, muddy wooded areas and overgrown ravines. They dragged heavy branches aside, battling through thick underbrush and unpredictable spring weather, scanning the steep ditches along the rural routes for any glint of chrome, shattered glass, or disturbed earth. The physical toll on the volunteers was immense, their boots sinking into wet clay as they combed through thousands of acres of unforgiving terrain. Yet, the numbers of searchers only multiplied as the hours ticked by. The atmosphere was thick with adrenaline and a desperate, clawing hope. Tips began pouring into the dedicated police hotlines by the minute. Sightings of black pickups were reported from distant border crossings to remote logging roads. Every single lead was chased down by exhausted detectives, and every single lead dissolved into a frustrating dead end. Back at the residence, the psychological toll was unbearable. The wife sat squarely in the epicenter of a media hurricane. Surrounded by flashing cameras and thrust microphones, she pleaded for the safe return of the man she loved. She spoke directly into the lenses, her voice trembling but resolute, addressing the unseen captors. She explained that he was a provider, that his young daughter was waiting by the door for him to come home. Her heartbreak was broadcast everywhere, gripping the public in a horrifying state of suspense. Where was the truck? Who were the two strangers? How could a massive piece of machinery evade every highway camera and patrol unit? Days turned into an agonizing, surreal blur of press conferences, shifting police updates and relentless ground searches. The initial surge of adrenaline within the community slowly mutated into a cold, creeping paranoia. People began locking their deadbolts before the sun went down. Online sellers rapidly pulled their classified ads off the internet, suddenly terrified of the anonymous faces that might show up at their property. The invisible predator had cast a long, suffocating shadow over the entire region, while the missing man remained a ghost. The first 48 hours of a missing persons case dictate the trajectory of the entire investigation. Homicide detectives took command of the precinct, setting up massive tactical whiteboards that remained agonizingly blank. The prepaid cell phone was their only tangible thread. Cybercrimes units pulled the regional cellular tower data, tracking the device's incredibly brief lifespan. The electronic trail showed the phone powering on near a suburban strip mall, moving steadily toward the victim's rural neighborhood, and shutting down completely just moments after the test drive began. It was a digital ghost. The perpetrators had actively avoided toll highways, keeping the stolen heavy-duty pickup off the main grid and entirely out of view of automated traffic cameras. Detectives were operating in a total blackout. The frustration inside the command center was palpable, heavy with the terrifying knowledge that a citizen had been erased without leaving a single physical trace on the asphalt. Investigators were forced to pivot their strategy. If the perpetrators used the popular classified site to target this specific truck, they had likely cast a wider net beforehand. Cyber analysts requested the server logs from the website's hosting company, cross-referencing IP addresses and search queries for identical diesel models in the region. They compiled a sprawling list of recent sellers and began knocking on doors. It was tedious, exhausting shoe leather police work. Most interviews yielded absolutely nothing. Detectives spoke with regular citizens who had successfully sold their vehicles or simply taken their listings down after losing interest. Then, they found the imposing former military man who had aggressively hijacked his own test drive a day prior to the disappearance. Seated across from investigators in a cramped interview room, he calmly recounted the bizarre encounter. He detailed the mismatched duo, the tall, overly polite speaker, and the silent, hooded shadow. He explained how the air in his cab had felt entirely wrong, a primal warning that prompted him to shut down the drive and return home. But it was a passing observation that ultimately broke the case wide open. The veteran noted that while the tall man gripped the steering wheel, his dark sleeve had ridden up, revealing a distinct black ink tattoo on his lower wrist. The word was ambition. A physical identifier changed the entire landscape of the hunt. Intelligence analysts fed the height, build, and the specific wrist tattoo into regional databases, expecting to generate a hit for a low-level car theft ring or a known chop shop operator. Instead, the algorithm produced a profile that brought the entire command center to a dead halt. The face on the screen belonged to a multimillionaire private aviation heir, a man with zero financial motive to steal a used vehicle. Detectives stared at the dossier in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the immense wealth, the helicopters, the sprawling properties, the corporate trusts, with a violent suburban hijacking. It defied every fundamental rule of criminal profiling, but the digital evidence began to align with terrifying precision. Warrants were expedited for the heir's personal cell phone records, bypassing the dead burner device entirely. The geolocation data placed his primary phone on the exact same rural highway at the exact time the victim vanished. The illusion of the untouchable criminal mastermind fractured instantly under the weight of basic forensic tracking. The tactical response was massive and immediate. Heavily armed police units mobilized, rolling out in a synchronized convoy toward the heir's sprawling rural properties and the regional airport. The sheer scale of the suspect's assets complicated the raid. Officers had to secure multiple locations simultaneously, navigating acres of private farmland and massive commercial structures. The heir was intercepted while driving one of his luxury SUVs, pulled over by unmarked tactical units on a public road. He was ordered out of the vehicle at gunpoint. He complied with smooth, eerie calm, his face entirely devoid of surprise or panic. He believed his immense wealth and his meticulous cleanup had insulated him from any real consequences. He assumed the police had nothing but circumstantial theories. He was wrong. The primary tactical team breached the heavy steel doors of the 50,000 square foot aviation hangar. Officers flooded the dimly lit, cavernous space, their weapon-mounted lights sweeping over vintage cars, aircraft parts, and custom commercial trailers. Tucked deep in the back, partially obscured by heavy equipment, sat a large enclosed cargo hauler. Detectives broke the heavy padlocks and threw open the rear doors. Inside sat the stolen 2007 Dodge Ram. The exterior was intact, but the interior had been violently stripped. The seats were torn out. The carpeting was ripped away to the bare metal floorboards. Gunpowder residue and microscopic blood spatter coated the remaining dashboard panels. The truck was a rolling tomb. The discovery of the vehicle secured the theft and assault charges, but a man was still missing. Forensic teams expanded their grid, moving outside the steel fortress to catalog the surrounding agricultural property. Hidden in plain sight, sitting quietly in a patch of tall grass near the tree line, was the towering industrial animal incinerator. The exterior steel was coated in a fine layer of fresh soot. Detectives approached the machine cautiously, the air around it still carrying a faint, heavy chemical odor. Crime scene technicians unlatched the heavy access doors and peered into the firing chamber. The visual confirmation hit the veteran officers like a physical blow. The extreme heat of the propane burners had destroyed almost everything, but the process was imperfect. Sifting through the heavy gray ash, technicians uncovered fragments of bone that had survived the 1500-degree inferno. It was the absolute horrific realization of the victim's fate. He had not been dumped in a river. He had not been buried in a shallow grave. He had been vaporized in a piece of machinery by a man who simply wanted to see if he could get away with murder. The psychological profile of the predator was now entirely clear to the investigators. This was a thrill kill, orchestrated by a sociopath completely insulated by extreme wealth. Within hours of the Hangar raid, police tracked down the hooded shadow, the aspiring rapper hiding out in his mother's basement. Surrounded by tactical shields, he surrendered without a fight. The fragile alliance between the mastermind and his attack dog immediately fractured under the intense pressure of the interrogation rooms and looming homicide charges. The pieces of the dark puzzle were finally locked into place. The physical evidence was secured. The perpetrators were in handcuffs. The investigation transitioned from a frantic search and rescue into an ironclad preparation for legal warfare. The trial commenced in a suffocatingly tense courtroom. Stripped of his sprawling estates, the aviation heir sat at the defense table, his trademark arrogance slowly eroding. In a desperate final flex of his god complex, he fired his legal team and represented himself. He personally cross-examined witnesses, even the victim's grieving wife, attempting to weave convoluted alternate theories of a robbery gone wrong. The prosecution dismantled his delusions with undeniable science. They presented the violently stripped Dodge pickup, the exact digital footprint of the burner phone, and the microscopic fragments recovered from the industrial incinerator. The co-defendant took the stand, turning on his master in a frantic bid for leniency. He detailed the sudden gunshot inside the moving vehicle and the cold, mechanical cleanup at the hangar. The overwhelming forensic weight left no room for doubt. It took the jury just 5 days to return a verdict. Both men were found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty: life in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The limitless wealth and private fleets could not buy a way out of an 8x10 concrete cell. The illusion of absolute entitlement ultimately collapsed under its own weight. A sprawling aviation dynasty, built over generations, was reduced to a footnote in criminal history, dismantled by the arrogance of an heir who believed the world was his to take. The wealth is gone. The hangars are empty. But the real tragedy remains anchored in a quiet suburban home, a permanent, devastating void where a husband and father used to be. A heavy price paid for a piece of machinery. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.